Well, Stephen Matthew, it's really nice to catch up with you in a really busy and exciting week in the area of cross-border tax. Just earlier in this week, we had the OECD hold a webcast on where BEPS 2.0 and the taxation of the digitalized economy is going. I'm really interested in your views. Maybe, I don't know, Steve, why don't I ask you first? What was your reaction to the material shared?
Well, it's really interesting. They clearly have done a phenomenal amount of work and made a lot of technical progress, both on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. There was a lot said about the fact that there are still fairly significant gaps remaining. The OECD's original timeline was to reach consensus by now. Many folks thought that that was a very ambitious timeline to begin with. It's not a big surprise. They still have a lot to do. They have a real struggle in trying to keep it simple yet meet all the needs of the countries going there, and that involves some very difficult trade-offs. So not surprised they've got a long way to go, but there is a lot there to think about.
How did you find it, Matthew?
Yeah, I think I'd echo what Steve said. I mean, I think it was encouraging to see that there was a lot of similarity there in terms of what we were expecting to see. Obviously, an evolution of the unified approach that came out sort of this time last year. And so it felt like a lot of the core of what was in there was largely as expected. But I think, as Steve says, I mean, the difficult thing now is the implementation, the rule coordination, but also bottoming out sort of all of the different technical aspects of actually bringing these rules to life. And interestingly, you know, the references in there around sort of coming up with, you know, model legislation, all sorts of guidelines that they're going to need to help countries come up with for, you know, proper implementation and effective use of the rules. I think one of the things that is good about what they released on Monday as well is the public consultation. Obviously, over the last sort of few months, you know, consultation has sort of gone on through digital means informally with stakeholders. But I think it's great that there is a proper 8-week public consultation here, taking us all the way through to the end of the year. And then, as Steve says, I think, you know, still an ambitious timetable to reach agreement by the middle of next year, which is what they're aiming for now.
And it's ambitious, but of course, when we sort of think about it from a multinational's perspective, there's a lot to think about now too, right? What do you think people should be thinking about now as a result of that discussion?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of sort of starting to model out the potential impact, you know, maybe doing some scenario planning and starting to think through what the likely sort of cash tax and ETR impact is. And part of that is educating yourselves and the institution around you about these reforms and sort of managing your stakeholders to get ready for all of this. Because, you know, even though it's only sort of soft law as ever with the OECD and it's still on a journey towards a final destination, I think it's very clear that something's going to happen out of this process. It's a few years out, but I think, you know, multinationals who are in scope of this, and actually, you know, the OECD does say it's going to affect, you know, 90% of global tax revenues, I think is the number they put out there. So that's a significant slug of companies. I think it is about getting ready now and probably starting to think through engagement in the consultation process in the short term.
What's your take on what people should be doing these days, Steve?
Well, I think it's important to understand that this is a very broad-based initiative. And so, you know, just as, I mean, we saw in the US when we had tax reform, companies really need to spend a little effort to wade through it and say, what parts of this are important to me and what parts of it aren't, right? Because it's definitely not an exercise where there's sort of one group of companies that it affects and every piece of it affects those companies and then everybody else doesn't have to worry about it. It's quite the opposite of that. There are bits there that affect everybody and that everybody needs to be worrying about. There are other pieces that if you're not a highly digitalized company, you probably don't need to spend too much time on. And so I think just working through the package and, you know, with respect to your business and understanding what pieces you should think about and what you shouldn't, and what aren't that important to you is going to be a first stage process. And I would suggest doing that fairly quickly, because we do have this, fairly nice 2-month comment period. And I think this comment period is going to be extremely important, and companies should really think about, again, identifying what's the important parts of it, what they think is going to be unworkable in practice. I think the OECD is very eager to get that kind of information. And so thinking about how you want to weigh in on this process, whether putting a comment on your own behalf, working as part of a trade association, and also talking to your home government are all channels that I think are going to be very important. And I think there is a lot of scope to influence and make rules more sensible, particularly making them more sensible and more workable. Given some of the implementation challenges that are out there, is going to be a really important thing that companies should be thinking about. As well, of course, is the longer term analysis that Matthew was talking about, where you've got stakeholders who really want to understand what are the potential hits that are going to happen to your ETR over the next few years.
Well, so that's interesting. So you both mentioned, the modeling, the upcoming comment period, talking with stakeholders. What else do we see coming around the corner on this topic? Because there's certainly a long way to go, right?
Well, there are definitely more shoes to drop. I mean, I think that's clear. And I think, the OECD has now said they're targeting middle of next year. Whether that's realistic or not remains to be seen. I think, one thing to watch for is what shoes are going to drop on the DST side, in terms of if we're going to start seeing more DSTs going into effect, particularly as we start getting into 2021. And then what are the potential responses, to those DSTs? I think that dynamic is really what's, kind of driving this. And so now, the reality of, yes, we're going to face that world where we're getting unilateral measures, and the unpleasantness of that is going to be very interesting. It's going to be very important in terms of how this develops and how quickly they reach some kind of consensus next year.
Yeah, Matt, I'll give you the final word on that.
I think I'd agree with that. I mean, I think as well, a lot of groups that I talk to are really starting now to think about building the systems and processes side of this as well. So I think that's you can sort of get a broad architecture of what these rules are going to look like, and they are going to be complex. They are going to be difficult to apply. There's going to be a lot of accounting questions in there as much as anything else. And I think actually just having, systems and processes that are fit for identifying, where your users are, what the in-scope revenues are, pulling those out of sort of aggregated numbers and identifying them is going to be a really challenging piece. So I think that's what I see a lot of companies starting to focus on now. As Steve rightly says as well, I mean, there is a broader sort of landscape. How does this, interact in terms of rollback and standstill of the other measures that are out there? Sort of where that all takes us sort of remains to be seen. But I think that's why the OECD is continuing to try to push ahead, at a relatively accelerated pace, because I think it's important, as they've said in the papers on Monday, they see the success of this as being central to reining in and rolling back those other measures.
Well, no good deed goes unpunished. Lots of things for folk to be thinking about. And I think, Matthew, that last point is probably relevant, right? Which is, even if there is a delay, getting thoughts around resource needs, systems and compliance and stuff like that, that's not something you decide overnight. So plenty of work for folk to be thinking about as we talk and as this continues to unfold. Well, both, thank you for your time. It's great catching up with you both, and I really look forward to catching up with you in person sometime when we're able to fly.
Thanks, Rodney. Good talking to you.
You too.